Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series of classes from the Sandy Granite Family History Center. And tonight we have the very distinct pleasure of having our instructor, Mr. James Tanner, with us tonight. James has done, I would say, probably hundreds of videos and presentations, both line and on Zoom and other platforms. And he is a prolific writer, and he writes for several blogs that he runs. And he is the president of the board of directors for the Family History Guide. And not only that, he and his wife Ann are just really good friends and supporters from day one. And we so appreciate James and what he does and his influence in genealogy and family history in general throughout the world. Tonight, James is going to be taking on the topic of how do you document your family history? And if you want to hear from one of the best, most seasoned researchers and documentarians, I think some of that comes from his past history as an attorney and whatnot, and a few other things that he's done. It's a pleasure to hear from him, and we'll turn the time now over to James Tanner.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm glad to be here this evening. One of the things I would like to say about this presentation is that when I talk about how to document your family history, I'm basically giving the real bottom basis for being a genealogist or being a family historian. This isn't it's not a light subject, but it is a very, very important subject because of what I'm going to talk about. So we're going to jump right into it and get going here. First, some definitions. We need to be understanding when we're talking about doing family history, we have to really understand the terminology because there's this is kind of a jargon, but in a sense, a specialized language. But when we're talking about specific things in genealogy, we do want to make sure everyone understands this particular topic and terminology. So genealogy, first of all, is the activity of searching, studying, and preserving your ancestry and family history. It can be extended to other people, obviously. It's not just your history, but everyone's history. And the activity that's involved there is quite technical in some aspects. It's something, of course, that people can do to some extent, just very beginning things that can be done. But ultimately, it involves a lot of complicated processes, including foreign languages and reading old records and some of the other things that the genealogists happen to get into. But foremost of all, genealogy is history. It's the history of individuals, and they have a tendency to be overlooked in the general world of history. If you took an American history class or another class on history ever from high school on up, you realize that the number of people who are mentioned are rather small number of people, and they're all people who were involved in very important events as judged by historians. And we're going to be talking in genealogy about people who were not only not famous, they weren't even notable. And to some extent, the hardest thing is no one ever bothered, even themselves, bothered to make too much of a record of their lives. So we are looking at the opposite, the polar opposite of what most historians are involved with. But despite your experience in the past with a history class, history is not boring. I have to emphasize it is really where it's at. History is the story of all of our lives, jointly and individually. And to the extent that we learn that history, we find out about the remarkable things that happened to some of our ancestors and the tremendous times that they spent, the times that they lived through, and the things that they had to both suffer and benefit from. So if we think of genealogy as history, then we understand that genealogical research is based on finding, reviewing, and recording historical information about your relatives and ancestors from the records of their lives. Okay, so first of all, we learn from this that we're looking at records, and then we're going through the records and finding the information that's pertinent to our family, and then we're recording that information and organizing it. So basically, the discovery process of genealogy involves looking at historical records, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Genealogically valuable records are those that were created at or near the time of an event by someone who witnessed the event or had a duty to record it. So how does that work? Well, let's take a birth record, for example. If the first rule of genealogy is that when a baby is born, the mother is there or was there. And since that's the basic of this, if we have someone providing that information, the mother, we are assured of the fact that they were actually present at the time. Now, in our day and age, we were used to having what we call birth certificates here in the United States. And a birth certificate was a document that was created to show or attest to the birth of the baby. And it's usually signed by a doctor or somebody important, but the information given by that for that birth certificate may have been by somebody who was not actually present at the birth of the child, but is reporting the birth of the child. And so that's kind of where we're going to start to make some distinctions here about what we do and how we interpret the things that we investigate, the records that we investigate. But this is important because this tells you that these kinds of records are the ones that they're valuable because they are created by someone who was there at the event, or that had a duty, like a government official or a census taker, or somebody who was given the specific responsibility of recording a specific event in someone's life. And so these kinds of things, even a traffic cop who stops somebody and gives them a ticket, there you go. That ticket is then an evidence of an event that occurred in someone's life. So all of these different things can go together to give us some understanding of what happened during the lives of our ancestors. Now, almost all of the records for genealogy that are identified specifically as genealogical records, as opposed to records that we can get genealogical information from, but are not considered to be strictly records about individuals. What do I mean by what's the difference? Well, a tax record, for example, is obviously gives us some information about the individual who paid the tax. But the tax records were not kept in order to preserve information about the individual. They had a completely different reason. They were collecting income for the taxing authority, whoever it was that was collecting the taxes. So, but all the genealogical records, the ones that we think of, like church records and all the birth, death, and marriage records, those are vital records, and lots of other types of records. All those records are still organized geographically, even if they're out of the realm of what we would generally consider to be genealogical records. Historical records, always attached to the place, the geographic area where they were created. And whether they move, that's another rule of genealogy. The rule of genealogy is that records move, and that's kind of a fact of historical life. They can move clear across the country, they can go halfway around the world, but they still are attached in their origin to the place that they were created. So finding the records involves identifying the physical location that an event in your ancestor's life occurred. So if you can identify that physical location where something happened, you have a starting point for finding the genealogical records about that individual. Now, what if you don't have that? And I see that very, very frequently. Excuse me, sorry, I had that in my pocket. I see that very frequently. I see people who come to me and they say, I'm looking for my immigrant ancestor. And I say, well, where was he from? Well, he came from Italy. And I say, well, where in Italy was he born? We don't know that. Well, the fact that you don't know where this person was born, where some event occurred in his life in Italy, means you have to search every record in Italy to find this person. And chances are that his name or her name is going to be the same as thousands and thousands of other people. So you can see that's virtually impossible. So if we understand this vital importance of the place, then we can begin to actually make some progress in doing genealogical research. Now, just to clarify, the terms record and document are the same thing. Sometimes we'll say it's a record, sometimes we'll say it's a document, but we're meaning it's exactly the same thing. And it's in the world, pre-computer world, it was all paper or whatever paper substitute there was, vellum and papyrus and stuff like that. But essentially, the records were kept and maintained on a written surface. So it's going to be the process of physically looking at those written records in order to get the information. Now, of course, today we have this fabulous technology that's developed over the last 30 or 40 years, where we can take images of those and electronically broadcast them so that you can look at a document remotely. You can see it down as close as you could ever have seen it if you had it in front of you. And so it's just there's a different world. It's a different way of doing it. But when we do that, we're still working with records. We're still working with documents. And sometimes we call them sources. Well, we're going to kind of clarify that source term. So what's the first thing that we're going to be concerned with in genealogy? I mean, the really fundamental basic thing, the basic goal of genealogical research is to document parent-child relationships with a verifiable historical record. I have my father's name was, and you fill in that. Let's say somebody's father's name was John. You have a record for John. Do you have a record that shows who John's parents were? That's the fundamental question of moving from one generation to the next generation. You can have all sorts of records about this guy. You could have 100 records where he worked, how he got married, all of his kids' names, all their records, his whatever it is. But until you find that key record or that key document or something that tells you that this John was the son of this George, then you are not moving back in time. And so this is the connecting point between all of these generations. Now, you can go onto a website like Family Search Family Tree, and you can start clicking around, and perhaps you'll be interested that you click back on one of your lines and it keeps going back and back and back and back, and finally you're in the 15 or 1400s or even before. Some of these lines go clear back to Adam if you just keep clicking. Now, where does that line go to? Does it go back to Adam? The answer is absolutely not. It ends in the first generation where there is no document telling that this child is the child of this couple, this marriage, and this individual. If you have a document that shows that, that moves you back one more generation. If you don't, you cannot pass go. You cannot collect your $200. You cannot advance. So this is sort of the way that this all works. So to move back a generation, I'm going to emphasize this, you must find and cite a record showing a parent-child relationship. Now, there's two parts. The first is finding it, and the second is identifying the record where this occurred and providing whoever else comes along with that information. Now, why is that? Because if I come to, say, for instance, Samuel Charles Bryant and Sarah Sapley, and I see that their daughter's name was Marianne Bryant here in Family Search, and I look at all of the documents attached, the sources attached to these individuals, and I cannot find a record that shows that Marianne Bryant was the daughter of Samuel Charles Bryant and Sarah Stapley, then as far as I'm concerned, the pedigree line ends at that point. That's it. Marianne Bryant has no parents because we don't know. Now you could say, well, we just know in our hearts that Samuel Charles. No, it's too bad. You've got to have the document. And so the whole idea here, it's kind of the ultimate test of the validity of any pedigree is whether or not you can find that parent-child relationship. Now, if you want to go on your clickback, my clickback example, clicking, click, click, click. If you take the time to look at the sources attached to each of those individuals, and you start getting into the situation where there's a marriage record for the family, or there's a death record or something, but there's no parent-child relationship, that's the end of that particular line. I don't, it's imaginary past that point. We'll talk about that. So understanding this, then we understand that most of the time that we're spent doing genealogical research actually involves finding the records to start researching. Once I have the record, it's pretty straightforward what I have to do, even if it's not indexed and I have to go through every one of the pages in the record. Hopefully it's chronologically organized or some other way so that I can find the information more quickly. But many times we're basically in the process of sitting down and going page by page, name by name through the information that we need to find. So we spend a lot more time finding the records than we do extracting the name and putting them in the family tree. That's it doesn't take much time at all to get the information out of the record once we find it. It's the process of finding the records that takes all the time. So we start genealogical research by searching for the records by the location of the events in our ancestors' lives. So we have to know something about our ancestors. We have to know, we have to have a place attached. If they came to the United States in a certain time, and let's say in 1923, and they came to New York, best chances are they probably came through when they came to the United States, or maybe not New York, but they came through one of the seaports in the United States. So they're each of those possible events in their lives, that they came here, they got a job, they moved, they got on a farm, they bought a farm, they farmed for their lives, they had a bunch of kids, and then they died. All of those events, plus many others, make up the possible record cloud, you might call it, of records out there that could exist for an individual. And part of genealogical research is learning what all those records, what possible records could have been created, and then understanding how you would find those records once that you understood that the records were possible to find. Let's say this person went to Iowa and got a farm and became an Iowa farmer. Would you be surprised to know that there were farm co-ops in those days, and that they kept a lot of records, and that those farm co-op records are probably still available for someone who lived in the latter part of the 1800s? These are the kinds of things that becoming a genealogist involves this process. And let me just mention that there's no end product to that process. It's an ongoing product. As the longer I do genealogical research, the more sources, records, places where I could look for records that I learn about. Every time I do research new for someone who comes and asks me some questions, I end up looking and finding places for records that I never knew existed. And some of these are overwhelmingly large collections of records that I should have known about 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, but I don't. Okay, so basically, we need to record that information. Once we have it, we record it. Now, what we call there's a formal written way for recording these. And fortunately, we live in a world of forms and on computers, and we can fill in the blanks. But that's the process of doing the citation. We fill in the blanks with the information that tells all of the necessary information that we need to find that source again, that record or that document again. So what if I tell you that I got it out of the Robinson Family Genealogy for 6 Generations book? That's just great. So where did the book come from? Where was the book located? How do I go find that book? Now, in this day and age, in this world, I have ways that I could find that book because I have finding aids like Google and all of the websites out there that WorldCat and other websites that tell me all the places where a book could be. But it would be much faster if you said something like, I got it out of the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. And that would then tell me immediately where I needed to go to look at that source. And I would be saved a lot of time in searching, and you would be benefited by the fact that I would then believe what you had written to be correct in the sense that it reflected what was in that particular book. So that's exactly the process. There's all different kinds of citation systems out there. They're formal citation systems. If you did any formal kind of research or wrote formal papers during some part of your educational process, you'll realize that at some point in time, they told you had to cite your sources. And that citation system involved a structured way of doing footnotes and endnotes and all that kind of thing that went along with the paper. And that's what we try to do in family history and genealogy work. We want our sources cited. We don't necessarily care whether they're cited according to the Chicago Manual of Style, but this is the one that's used most generally by genealogists. And no one's going to fault you. There are no citation police out there that are going to tell you that your citation is wrong or whatever it is. But if you just remember the one fundamental thing, tell us where you got the information. That's the basic main idea, is to tell everyone where you got the information. And that's, once you've done that, then your chances of other people agreeing with you is increased immeasurably. One of the things that happens quite frequently, especially on an open family history tree like the Family Search family tree, is that people enter a lot of information without any sources. And as far as we're concerned, we can't believe what they say. So we make progress when we keep track of the records we find and where those records are located. And this is what's called a research log. Basically, there's lots of different ways of doing a research log. But one of the easiest ways to do it is when you find a document that you use is to put it on as a source on one of the computer programs, on Family Search Family Tree, or one of the other programs out there, Ancestry, MyHeritage, any of the desktop programs like Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest, or many, many others, Heredison from France, and all these different programs. All of them enable you to add what is called a source, and that's the citation, and that keeps track. And you can use that as your research log because you have it there. Some of us do a lot of research in records and need to keep track of which records we've looked at and which records we haven't looked at. And that research log can be much more extensive. I do sort of free-form research logs on just Microsoft Word documents. So I just create a document and start listing all the places I've looked and all the conclusions. And then I can go down through there and see where I am, and I sometimes color code the ones that I have seen and not seen and things like that. So there's a way to organize it, but it's personal to you. It's something that you're comfortable with, and you can find out what other genealogists have done, but not necessarily uh, you're not compelled to use any particular format. We're just saying that to start making progress in genealogy, there are certain things that you need to do, and these are the things that you do. So there's lots of different ways that people talk about genealogy and historical information, but basically what happens is that you analyze the records. You look at the records and say, what does this mean? Who are these people? Are they related? Is this the parents? Is this the children? What is it? And you form your opinion, and that opinion is a conclusion, becomes your conclusion. So you conclude that this person is the son or daughter of these parents. And that conclusion is based on your analysis and your reading of the records that you've gotten to. But here's a very big exception to this. With everyone's opinion about every historical record is subject to modification with our further research and the research of others. So for example, let me give you a modern day example of how this happens. You were you lived your whole life in your family. You knew who your father was, you knew who your mother was, you know who your brothers and sisters are, or if you had any, if you were an only child, but basically you have, your parents and so forth, your grandparents, and maybe even your great-grandparents. Well, let's suppose you take a DNA test today, and in your DNA test, you find out that in fact your parents were not your parents, that you were either adopted or just became part of a family. So what does that mean? Well, it means that any genealogical research you've done either needs to be done over, or you can basically say, I don't care who my biological parents are, I'm going to stick with my adopted parents. So that's fine. But you can see here that how your worldview of who your parents are can be modified rather dramatically. Well, if I find new records, for example, with anybody in the line, it's very possible that I may find that the parent-child relationship in that particular family at that generational level is not valid, and that somebody else was actually the parent. And that does happen occasionally. The further back in time you go, the more likely that kind of thing is to happen. Okay, so when does a record become a source? So you have to think about this as, did you actually do it? If you pull it off the shelf, let's say you pull the record off the shelf, if you examine the document and record and extract useful information and put that information into your family tree, that becomes a source. That's your source. So if you just look at it, maybe you keep it in your research log, but it doesn't become a source to what your conclusions are. I look at lots and lots of records before I find the one record or two records that may be the specific person I'm looking for. So that's kind of the point that we're making here. So it's helpful to think in categories of about records and their possible validity. In this case, we call them primary sources. Well, that's created at or near the time of an event. Now, that would be one of these birth records back in 1696 here that we have in front of us. So this kind of thing is the record that you would use, and we tend to put more believability, credence into these records when they were created at or near the time than we would to a record that was created later. So we have derivative documents, and those are indexes, compilations, books about the people in a family called surname books or ancestry books or descendancy books. And all of those are secondary sources because somebody copied, may or may not have an original document, copied the information and put the information into a book or into some other kind of record. And that basically creates let's say that it gives opportunity for more mistakes to have been made. So it's always less reliable, even though it may be the only source you end up with. That may be the only thing you have, but then you need to recognize that even though I only have this record of the birth that was written down 20 or 50 years after the person was born, that may be my only record, and I need to go with that as long as the record shows that that was the date. So if a record doesn't have an identifiable source, as far as I'm concerned, it's fantasy. You've moved into the imaginary world of your ancestors, who were the people you wish that you were related to, or you hoped you were related to, but you may not be related to. And if I come along and point out that fact, you shouldn't be upset or get cross at me or whatever else because I told you that you weren't related to this person because you don't have anything that shows that that child was that part of that person's family. So basically that's the end of it right there. Now we go back in time, we can still resolve those. Those people refer to those end of line situations as brick walls or end of lines. There's nothing, no outside force keeping you from finding the next person in that line. It's either a very physical situation where there simply are no records, no further records of that particular person or line, or that you haven't spent the time or the effort or even have any idea where to go to look for records that might find the next person back. And copying information from another person's family tree or file without verifying the information is also fantasy. Just because somebody else has it down does not give that any more believability or credence than anything else, than making it up. As a matter of fact, what if that other person simply made up that whole line back to a king in England or whatever? So why do we add the source citations? Well, I think I've talked a little bit about the why, but we'll put some reasons down here. They're necessary to establish the validity of the entries. In other words, I'm saying that an entry that has no sources simply has no validity, period. I can't even imagine where the name came from, or if it was just made up. But it may turn out that that's the right person. But until we find the record that supports that, we can't say for sure that that was the right person. So citations also provide information about where the information can be found. They provide additional information about where the information can be found. They indicate the status of the documentation. So I can quickly go back on any family line and tell you exactly where the last believable ancestor is, and that's it. I mean, it only takes a very short period of time, usually within 15 or 20 minutes, if someone's willing to sit down with me, and I've been saying this for many, many years. If you want to find out where the end of your lines are, just sit down with me for 15 or 20 minutes. We'll click back on your ancestors on the family tree, and the last ancestor that first ancestor that does not have a parent-child relationship is the last one on your line. That's it. Doesn't matter how many names go back from there. So it's not going to work. So they ultimately what citations do, and the added source is allow others to verify our entries and avoid the duplication of research. Otherwise, I have to go back and research all that and determine whether or not you actually have all those documents supporting back to that person, and then see if there is actually a document that we can extend the pedigree 1 or 2 or more generations. So when you're building your family tree, carefully consider the information that you've put in about each individual. Become acquainted with that person and their life, as limited as that may be. As you go back in time, you may only know where they were born. You may only know where they died, but you can learn about the town. You can learn about the church. You can learn about what records may be possible in that area. So think before you speak and read before you think. This was an interesting way to portray that. And basically the idea here is we evaluate, meaning we put a value judgment on the how reliable any particular document is. So if we look at a document and we decide that it's like a church record, for example, we say, well, the church had an interest in having the information correct. And so therefore it's probably more correct than if there was some other entity making that record who didn't really care whether the record is correct or not. And so that's basically the kind of foundation that you use for evaluating records. So when the evaluations that we use, we need to ask a series of questions. So we question who provided the information in the first place. And secondly, did they participate in or experience the event or events recorded? Were they actually there? Is this a first-hand document or is it a second-hand document? What is the time lapse between the event and the record? So some of this may be very difficult to determine. In some cases, for example, we rely on parish registers written by a parish priest that records baptisms and other ordinances of the primarily Catholic Church. And so basically, in my case, in Central and South America, it turns out, as I look through all of these Spanish language records, that occasionally it's very obvious that the priest didn't write the stuff down at the time and went back and just simply recorded all the baptisms as happening on the same day. Well, that may be the only record, and that's what we have to run with, but it's pretty obvious that that record is not nearly as reliable as to the actual date of baptism of the child. Did the person who observed the records and recorded events actually create the records or documents? So was it somebody who, when they signed the document, they just signed the document because somebody handed them a document and said, I need your signature? That's possible. And that happens with doctors on death certificates. It also happens with many, many other documents. Was the person drafting the record or document in a position to know or judge the accuracy? That's another one. When somebody sat down to write a document. So if you have a journal, for example, that's in the handwriting of the original person, and it's a first person journal, I did this, I did that, then you know that that person was in a position to know what was going on. But if it's a third person document that said, my great grandfather did this and my great grandfather did that, and oh, by the way, I didn't ever live during his time and I never met him, that may not have quite the believability as that first person event. How consistent and believable are the records? So they have to be consistent and believable. Sometimes it's not consistent and it's totally unbelievable. So we really need to stop name matching. That means just because the guy's name is Joseph Stevenson, for example, or something like that, and that doesn't mean that this is the same Joseph Stevenson. If you want a little bit of an exercise here, you can go on and search for names on one of the major websites and find out how many people have your same name or how many people have the same name of one of your ancestors. Once you see that there are 5,000 or 10,000 results with that name, you begin to understand that name matching is more like guessing. Adding a source to the family tree tells everyone where you obtained it. I'm re-emphasizing this. If we fill out this form for the source, that tells everyone who comes on subsequent to you where you got it and why you thought it was impersonal. Like to clarify, oral histories, personal knowledge, and letters are sources. Where you got the information is the source. If it was your grandmother who told you, that's the source. Or just because it's on a piece of paper doesn't genuinely or create a source. Basically, the source could be anything, but we need to know that. If you got that information from your grandmother, then we know that you got it from your grandmother, and she's probably not with us anymore. And so we may have to go to someplace else to get the information. But once we know that, that's very helpful. So when is a source not a source? It's easier to tell what is not a source sometimes than it is a source. So user created entries in a family tree that don't identify the information. That's just a long way of saying with no sources, they're not a source. You can't rely on anything that's there. Old GEDCOM files from personal ancestral file that lack source information. It doesn't matter who did this. If your great grandmother, your aunt, or whoever did this, had personal ancestral file and created this GEDCOM file, that does not mean even any of the information on there is believable or valid. It may be, but the easiest way to find out is to go sit down and look in Family Search and find out what Family Search already has to say about what's on that GEDCOM file before you start believing that it's accurate or good. Family group sheets and pedigrees without source notations, same category as the old GEDCOM files. Any document or record that's a copy of another document or record and doesn't tell you where they got the source. So you have this narrative in a surname book, in a book about your ancestors' family, and it said George crossed the ocean in 1627 and landed in the Massachusetts colony and became a prominent citizen. It goes on and on. It doesn't tell you one record where all that information came from. So how do we know that the person that they're talking about is even an ancestor? Even though it's a very nice story and everybody tells a nice story and they all have good feelings about it, it doesn't necessarily make it absolutely valid. Okay, carefully consider the information about each person before adding it as a source. Before you add a source, think about what it says. If you look here, it says he immigrated on 6 October 1864 in Utah. And then if you go across, you'll see that this one, the one on the right-hand side seems to have more information, like exactly where they were born and where they died, and says the immigration happened in 1869. Well, which one is correct? The answer would be simple. Do either of these two records have an actual immigration form or some record showing when they arrived in the United States? That's the question. Be careful and be critical of record hints. You can see all those little green leaves out there for ancestry, the little green icons. Those all considered to be record hints. Well, a fairly they're fairly accurate, but there's always a number of them that simply have the same name, same person problem, and are not the same person. So we need to go through those very carefully. Don't just click them and say, oh, well, Ancestry thinks it's correct. Well, no, Ancestry doesn't think. The computer has pulled these up. And I hope that you're a little bit smarter than the computer and look at the records. So watch out for entries with no sources. How many times can you click through and find no sources attached? Yeah. Well, each one of those is an invitation to do some real genealogical research, bearing in mind that the real search may show that that person is not really part of the family, or it may show that they are, and in which case you have a lot more information about your family than you had previously. So what's a duplicate source? The duplicate source here, on the top, it says Thomas Parkinson Mormon Migration Database. That was put in by me on September 10th of 17. And there's another one that's called Mormon Migration Database, and that was put in 2014. And that, yes, that is a duplicate. It's just more record. Two different people put in the record. I probably put it in because I didn't look and see if there was another one already in the database. And can we delete one of those two records? Yes, but why? That tiny bit of information does not take up any room. But if you want to go through and clean the house, that's great. But don't clean out the ones that aren't duplicates. Here's an 1860 federal census that I put in, and an 1860 federal census that someone else put in. Now, if you look over at the icons on the extreme left-hand side of the screen, you'll see one came from a source outside of Family Search, and one came from Family Search. These are two different sources. A census record from Ancestry is not the same as a census record from Family Search, even if it's exactly the same year and the same person, because it came from two different sources. It came from two different places. And we are interested in where the records came from. And if I have two different places with the same record, that gives me a much better chance of finding the record again. So we don't necessarily go through and hoe out these weeds because they're not weeds. So that you have to make sure they came from the same, they have the same information and came from the same place. And even if they were submitted by two different entities or people, doesn't matter. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm sure that that was a lot of information in a fairly short period of time.
Well, as usual, James, it's pretty doggone extensive, and it's perfect. And while you were talking there, I posted a couple of items over in the chat where additional information can be found, including the one blog post that you wrote for the Family History Guide called "When is a Brick Wall Not a Brick Wall?" Remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I found that one and posted that up. So there are places, additional resources that people can look to learn about doing research and citations and things, all located in the Family History Guide. Are there any questions for James at this point?
You know, I understand one thing that I do come across as being somewhat dogmatic. In other words, this is the way it is. Live with it, folks. No, but the thing about that is that these are so basic and fundamental things that it's like, you know, it's the kind of things where, like, if you're learning how to drive, they'd say, well, what happens if you run out of gas? Well, then you have to learn how to put gas in your car. Well, this is the kind of thing that's so basic to getting genealogy, that you look at the sources and you look at the locations. So many times I see families in the Family Search, in Family History, in the Family Search family tree, where you'll look down a list of 6 or 8 children and find out they were born in all over the country, in different parts of the country. And that's just physically impossible depending on the time period. Probably usually physically impossible. Unless the mother was a traveling saleswoman.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Anyway, thanks, Bob.
You bet. We'd like to thank everyone. And this class will be available on the Sandy Granite Family History website in just a few days, along with many others that have been done in the past. And the address of that website, in case you don't know, is www.granitefhc.com, granitefamilyhistorycenter.com. And with that, we'll bid farewell to you all until our next class. Thank you very much.
Thanks.